The night my husband let me play with his nephew was one of the most exciting nights of my life. It all began a few weeks ago when the sun set, casting a soft orange glow over the city skyline. From our townhouse window, I watched the evening take hold, with the faint sounds of distant conversation mingling with the hum of traffic below. Normally, this tranquility instilled a sense of peace within me, but tonight it was accompanied by a heavy weight. Benjamin, my husband, had left earlier that afternoon for a weekend work retreat. It wasn't the first time he'd gone on business, but his departure felt different today, perhaps because he had asked me to kiss goodbye, Sophia, lingering for a moment. Keep an eye on Ethan while I'm gone. He's still figuring things out, and I don't want him to feel like a guest. Make him feel at home. Ethan, his nephew, just 19, had been staying with us for a couple of weeks fresh out of high school and preparing for college in the city. He'd arrived at our door with bags slung over his shoulders and an endearing mix of shyness and gratitude. Benjamin had insisted we take him in for a while to help him get settled. I hadn't minded that. Ethan was polite, respectful, and had a certain quiet charm that was easy to be around still. The house felt different with Benjamin gone. The dynamic between Ethan and me had always been cordial, but tonight, as the sky deepens to twilight and the house settled into its usual evening stillness, I felt a subtle shift. Maybe it was the absence of his steady presence, or perhaps something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It at 7, when I heard the familiar creak of the stairs, Ethan appeared in the doorway to the living room, his dark hair slightly tousled, dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans. He gave me a small smile as he stepped inside, the kind that made him look younger than he was. "Hey, Auntie Sophia," he greeted, his voice soft and warm. "Benjamin told me you'd be here all weekend." "That's right," I said, setting aside from the book I hadn't really been reading. "He didn't want you to feel abandoned." He laughed lightly, sitting down on the couch across from me. "He worries too much." "I'm okay." We fell into a cozy stillness, and I couldn't help but observe as he extended his long legs and relaxed his stance on the couch. He seemed more at ease than usual tonight. "Are you hungry?" A little later, I inquired. He did, in fact, confess, sitting up. "What's for supper?" "A little." I got up and waved. "Let's work it out." He followed me to the kitchen. We agreed on a straightforward meal, pasta with a quick homemade sauce, and Ethan offered to assist. We moved through the kitchen in a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural as he chopped vegetables with precision, his hands steady and sure, while I stirred the pot on the stove. Our conversation was lighthearted and occasionally filled with jokes or anecdotes. "You're not bad at this," I said, looking at him as he skillfully chopped a tomato, and he smiled. "Neither are you." "I was afraid you might burn." After dinner, we moved back to the living room, where Ethan took his usual sprawled position on the couch, his body stretching out as though he owned the space. As soon as the food was ready, we sat down at the dining table, and the soft glow of the overhead light cast a warm ambience over the room. Conversation flowed easily, and I found myself hanging on every word he said. His plans for college were thoughts on the city and a few funny stories about Benjamin from his childhood. Tonight he exuded a confidence that was fresh and intriguing, a sense of comfort. He thanked her for supper. "It was pleasant to break the stillness after a while. You didn't have to do all that." I said, "It's no trouble. It was enjoyable to me." This time there was a heavier pause. When Ethan and I locked eyes, it seemed as if the room had suddenly become smaller. The air around us was heavy, charged with something unsaid but tangible. "I think I'll go to bed soon," he whispered, but he didn't get up. "Yeah," I said quietly, although my heart was pounding in my chest. He lingered for a moment longer, his eyes darting over me in a way that seemed purposeful, and then he stood and said, "Good night, Auntie Sophia." I observed him, Ethan. As he retreated up the stairs, I heard his footsteps fade, and he vanished into the corridor. I remained there for a while, feeling as though something had changed tonight. Even though I was unable to articulate it clearly, I knew that I wasn't ready for the night to end just yet. The house was now silent, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards and the faint ticking of the wall clock, so I remained in the living room as night fell. After a while of staring at the fireplace's flickering light, my thoughts kept returning to Ethan. There had been something about his demeanor tonight that I couldn't quite place, but I also couldn't ignore. Eventually, I made my way upstairs, walking softly on the carpeted stairs. The hallway was dimly lit only by the faint glow of the nightlight near the guest room, and Ethan's door was slightly ajar. I hesitated as I passed it, the sound of his gentle breathing reaching my ears. I shook my head, trying to clear my head, thinking that this was absurd, and went to my bedroom. I closed the door behind me, but even as I got into my pajamas and went to bed, my thoughts kept returning to him. His easy smile and the way his eyes lingered on mine for just a beat too long made me turn over and stare at the ceiling. The stillness of the house felt oppressive, and the silence was loud in my ears. I wasn't sure what made me do this, but after what seemed like hours, I found myself slipping out of bed, my bare feet silent against the floor as I moved down the hallway, guided by some unsaid pull. Ethan's door was still ajar. The faint light from his bedside lamp cast a soft glow into the hallway, and I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I called out to him, barely above a whisper, and there was a rustle of movement from inside, and then his voice was warm and gentle. When I walked in, he was sitting up in bed with the blankets pulled around his waist. His dark hair was mushy, and his eyes were heavy with sleep but alert, I confessed. He stood awkwardly by the door, grinning faintly and tilting his head slightly. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the weight of the silence weighing on us. Then, almost reluctantly, Ethan patted the empty space on the bed next to him. "Do you want to sit?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. I hesitated, every rational part of me screaming that this was a bad idea, but there was something in his gaze, an openness, a quiet vulnerability, that drew me, and I crossed the room and Purr was on the edge of the bed. "Careful to keep a respectable distance, is something on your mind?" he asked, his tone gentle but curious. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I don't know," I said finally. "Just restless, I guess." He nodded, his gaze steady on mine. Me too. The air between us felt heavy again, thick with unspoken words and unacknowledged feelings. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, taking in the sharp angles of his jaw, the curve of his lips. He looked different in the soft light. Softer, more vulnerable. "I'm glad you're here," he said. Suddenly, his voice breaking the silence, I turned to him, my brow furrowing. Slightly confused, he shrugged, his eyes dropping to his hands. "I don't know. It's comforting to have someone nearby who understands my request, even though my voice is barely audible." He looked up at me, then his gaze piercing and raw. "What it's like to feel alone, like no one really sees you." The honesty in his words hit me like a punch to the gut. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "I see you," I said softly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. His eyes widened slightly, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then slowly he reached out his fingers, brushing against mine. The touch was electric, sending a shiver down my spine. My breath hitched, and I looked at him, searching his face for some sign of what he was thinking. "Ethan," I began, my voice trembling slightly, but he shook his head, cutting me off. "It's okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just need this." Even if it's just for a moment, I didn't know what to say in my mind. A whirlwind of thoughts and emotions, but as his fingers laced with mine, his touch warm and steady, I found myself leaning into him. The space between us dissolving. His other hand came up to cut my face. His touch was gentle but firm. I closed my eyes, the world falling away as I surrendered to the moment. To him our lips met tentatively at first, a soft brush of skin against skin. But then the kiss deepened, the heat between us, building with each passing second. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I let my own hands find their way to his shoulders. It was wrong, I knew that, but in that moment it felt like the most natural thing in the world. His lips were warm against mine, soft but insistent. I felt the weight of him, the closeness, the undeniable pull that had been simmering beneath the surface all evening. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat loud and frantic in the quiet of the room. "Ethan," and I whispered against his mouth, unsure of what I was trying to say. Was I asking him to stop or to continue even if I didn't know? But he didn't pull away. Instead, he deepened the kiss, his hands gripping my waist with a firmness that sent a shiver racing down my spine. I found myself leaning into him, my body responding in ways that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. He broke the kiss, his forehead resting against mine as we both tried to catch our breath, his eyes searching mine, dark and intense, as if trying to gauge what I was. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. His voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, though my mind was spinning. "Yeah," I managed to say, though the word felt small and inadequate. He smiled faintly, his thumb brushing lightly against my cheek. "Good," he said, his voice tinged with relief. For a moment we just sat there, the silence between us thick but not uncomfortable. I could feel his heartbeat against mine, the steady rhythm grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. But as the initial haze of the kiss began to fade, reality started to creep back in, the weight of what we were doing, of who we were to each other, looming large in my mind. "You know this is crazy," I said finally, my voice trembling slightly. Ethan chuckled softly, his breath warm against my skin. "Yeah," he agreed, his tone light but serious. "But it doesn't feel wrong, does it?" I hesitated. The question was hanging in the air between us. Did it feel wrong? My rational mind screamed that it did. This was a line we should never have crossed. But my heart, my traitorous, aching heart, told a different story. "No," I admitted, the word slipping out before I could stop it. "It doesn't." His smile widened slightly, a flicker of something like hope in his eyes. "Then maybe it's not," he said softly, his hand still cradling my face. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that this moment, this connection, was pure and right, but fear and doubt hovered at the edges of my mind, threatening to drag me back to reality. What if I started, only to find the words stuck in my throat? What if this changes everything? Ethan shook his head, his gaze steady and unwavering. "It doesn't have to," he said firmly. "We can approach it gradually, without any pressure or expectations." Just this, he leaned in again, his lips brushing softly against mine, and I felt myself relax the tension in my chest, easing slightly. His hands moved to my back, pulling me closer, and I let him use my own hands tangling in his hair. The kiss deepened, the heat between us building once more. His touch was careful but insistent, his movements deliberate and unhurried. It was as if he was taking his time, savoring every moment and every sensation. I lost myself in him, in the warmth of his embrace, in the way he made me feel seen, understood, wanted, and wanted. It was intoxicating, overwhelming. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to simply feel as the night stretched on. The boundaries between us blurred further, the connection between us growing stronger with each passing moment. The world outside faded away, leaving only the two of us, lost in the quiet intimacy of the night. When we finally pulled away, our breathing heavy and our body pressed close, I gazed at him, feeling both filled and burdened simultaneously. "This is going to complicate things, isn't it?" I said softly, a faint smile tugging at my lips despite the weight of my words. Ethan grinned, his eyes sparkling with mischief and affection. "Probably," he admitted, "but I think it's worth it." I nodded, my chest tight with a mix of emotions I couldn't fully name. "Yeah," I said quietly. "Me." So Ethan rested his head on my shoulder. His breath warm against my neck. In the room was silent except for the soft hum of the night outside and the occasional creak of the house settling. I wrapped an arm around him, pulling him closer, and he sighed contentedly. We stayed like that for a while, the quiet between us filled with unspoken thoughts. I could feel the rhythm of his breathing, steady and calming, and it gave me a moment to collect myself. My mind raced, replaying everything that had just happened. Every touch, every glance, every whispered word. "I don't want this to be a one-time thing," Ethan said suddenly, his voice breaking. The silence was quiet but firm, laced with a vulnerability that made my chest tighten. I hesitated, my fingers tracing absent patterns on his back. "Neither do I admitted softly, "but I don't know how we make this work." Ethan lifted his head to look at me, his eyes filled with a determination that caught me off guard. "We'll figure it out," he said. "We don't need to possess all the answers immediately. We simply approach the situation day by day." His words were reassuring, but the weight of the situation still lingered. The reality of what we'd done, of what we were now to each other, was a lot to process, but at the same time, the thought of letting this go, of letting him go, was unbearable. Okay, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper, one day at a time. He smiled, leaning in to press a soft kiss to my forehead. That's all we need, he said. His words, a quiet promise. We stayed like that for a while longer. Wrapped up in each other, the rest of the world forgotten, it felt safe and comforting, like we'd found something we didn't even know we were looking for. Eventually the night began to catch up with us, the weight of exhaustion settling in. Ethan shifted, pulling away slightly to look at me. We should probably get some sleep, said, his voice tinged with reluctance. I nodded, though I didn't want to let go of him just yet. Yeah, I agreed. My own reluctance clear in my tone, but then he turned to look at me, his expression open and raw. I don't want to leave, he admitted, his voice trembling with vulnerability. I don't want this to end, and I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. At his words, then, don't I say, my voice steadier than I felt, stay his searched mine for a moment before he leaned in, his hand finding mine and holding it tightly. Are you sure? He asked, his voice barely audible, as if he was afraid of breaking the fragile connection between us. I'm sure, I said, and I meant it. Without another word, he closed the distance between us, his lips meeting mine in a kiss that was soft and tentative, but laced with an undeniable hunger. I responded instinctively to my hands finding their way to his face, pulling him closer. The world outside vanished as we immersed ourselves in each other, the flickering shadows of the firelight illuminating the room. Every touch and every kiss felt like a revelation, a deepening of the bond that had always been there but had only now come to light. It really went from bad to worse, and I did not know what a young guy was capable of. His touches were truly remarkable, and I was convinced that they would be his last, but he was prepared for another round. Eventually, I think we finished after 5 or 6 times. When we were done, Ethan's hands slid up my arms, his touch sending shivers down my spine. I've wanted this for so long, he murmured against my lips, his voice thick with emotion. I just didn't know if you felt the same. I didn't realize it either. I admit my forehead is resting against his, but now that I do, I don't want to stop. He smiled softly, his thumb brushing against my cheek, and then we went on stretching the hours as we explored this new territory together, each moment more intense and more intimate than the last. There was no hesitation, no fear, only a shared understanding that this was where we were meant to be. By the time the fire had burned down to embers, we were wrapped in each other's arms, our breathing slow and steady. Ethan's head rested against my chest, and I ran my fingers through his hair, marveling at how right it all felt. He whispered softly, his voice barely audible above a whisper. I nodded, pressing a kiss to his forehead. It does. I agreed, but it's a change I'm ready for. We'll figure this out together, one step at a time. Ethan smiled, his eyes meeting mine with a warmth that made my heart ache. I trust you, I said simply. I trust you, replied, my voice filled with conviction as the night stretched on. We stayed there on the couch, wrapped in each other's warmth, unwilling to let the moment and whatever challenges lay ahead go. We knew we would face them together. Bound by a love that had finally been set free, the next morning I woke to the faint sound of birds outside the window and the soft creak of footsteps in the hallway. For a moment I wasn't sure if the events of the previous night had been real or some vivid dream, but the lingering warmth in my chest told me it was true. Every glance, every whispered word, every shared moment. I took a deep breath and got out of bed, pulling on a sweater as I made my way to the kitchen. Ethan was already there, standing in the kitchen. By the counter with a cup of coffee in his hands, his hair was slightly messy, and he wore an oversized hoodie that made him look younger and more vulnerable. He looked up as I entered, his face breaking into a shy smile. He said, his voice soft but warm, "Morning." I replied with my voice still groggy with sleep, and I moved to pour myself a cup of coffee in the silence between us, comfortable but charged. The weight of what we'd shared hung in the air unspoken, but ever present. Ethan leaned against the counter, watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I nodded, meeting his gaze. "Yeah," I said, "I'm okay." "Are you?" Hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yeah," he said, his voice slightly trembling. "It's just that I can't stop thinking about last night." I set my coffee down and stepped closer to him, placing a hand on his arm. "Me neither," I admitted, "but it's a lot to process. We need to take this slow and figure out what this means for us." Ethan nodded, his expression softening. "I don't want to rush anything," he said. "I just don't want to lose you." "You won't," I said firmly, squeezing his arm. "We'll figure it out together." He smiled, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Thank you," he said slightly. Softly, we spent the rest of the morning in quiet companionship, sharing small smiles and touches as we went about our day. We had an unspoken understanding, a mutual agreement to approach things gradually. As the day wore on, I found myself watching Ethan more closely, noticing the way he moved, the way he smiled, and the way his eyes lit up when he laughed. It was like seeing him in a new light, and it filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. By the time evening rolled around, we found ourselves on the couch again. The soft glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls. Ethan sat close to me, his shoulder brushing against mine, and I felt a quiet contentment settle over me. "Do you think this is crazy?" he asked. Suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper, I turned to look at him. Surprised by the vulnerability in his tone. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his gaze fixed on the fire. "I guess it's not exactly normal." I reached out, taking his hand in mine. "Maybe it's not normal," I said, "but it feels right, and that's what matters." He turned to look at me, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. "You really think so?" "I do," I said, my voice firm. "As long as we're honest with each other, and as long as we're careful, we can figure this out together." Ethan's smile was small but genuine, and he squeezed my hand tightly. "Thank you," he said, "for not running away. For giving this a chance." "I couldn't run away even if I wanted to," I said, a teasing smile tugging at my lips. "You're kind of hard to escape." He laughed. The sound was light and genuine, and it filled me with a quiet joy. In that moment, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. As the night wore on, we stayed like that, side by side, the warmth of the fire and the comfort of each other's presence wrapping around us like a blanket. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was ours, and I think that was enough. I'm not sure if it is okay what I did, and I haven't told Benjamin anything. Yet should I tell him I don't know? Just don't know.